The year is 1204. April 13th, the Constantinople is burning. But the smoke doesn't rise from Muslim siege towers, it rises from the torches of men wearing crosses. Inside the convent of Christ Pantoptes, 43 Orthodox nuns kneel in prayer. Their voices shake as they recite the Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. Outside they hear it, boots on stone laughter, the splintering of sacred doors. These women have lived their entire lives devoted to Christ. They've taken vows of chastity, poverty, silence. They expected martyrdom might come from pagans or infidels. They never imagined it would come from their own brothers in faith. Sister Euphemia is 73 years old. She's been a nun for 56 years, longer than most of the soldiers outside have been alive. Her hands, gnarled with age and decades of labor, clutch a wooden rosary so tightly her knuckles turn white. She spent half a century preparing for death at the hands of enemies. She never imagined those enemies would be wearing the cross of Christ. The sound grows closer, wood splintering. A scream from the convent next door cuts off abruptly. Then silence. Then the door explodes inward. The men who enter are drunk. Some are laughing. Their circuits bear the red cross. Some have Dios Volt, God wills it, stitched across their chests in golden thread. Sister Euphemia rises, her voice trained by decades of liturgical chant, cuts through the chaos. We are brides of Christ. You wear his symbol in his name. A fist crashes into her face. The force sends her sprawling. Blood pools beneath her silver hair. What the Crusaders, Catholic warriors of the Fourth Crusade, did in the hours that followed wasn't just conquest. It wasn't just war. It was something the Orthodox Church would call the greatest betrayal in Christian history. Something so brutal that 8 centuries later it still echoes in the split between East and West. The question isn't whether you can handle what happened next. It's whether you're willing to remember what your history books conveniently left out. If you're drawn to documented records the world buried, stories that textbooks sanitized or erased entirely, then every view, every like, every subscription helps us uncover more accounts like this one. We dig through Vatican archives, Byzantine manuscripts, eyewitness testimonies that scholars ignored for centuries. Now back to the story. Because what happened next makes Zara look like mercy. To understand how Christian soldiers ended up terrorizing Christian nuns, you need to understand how the Fourth Crusade became the greatest disaster in medieval Christianity. It started in 1198. Pope Innocent III, young, ambitious, burning with holy zeal, called for a new crusade. Not the suicidal march through hostile territory that had killed thousands before. This time, they would sail directly to Egypt, cut off Muslim supply lines, then sweep north to reclaim Jerusalem. Strategic, surgical, brilliant. Tens of thousands answered the call. French knights, German soldiers, Italian merchants seeking profit wrapped in piety. They gathered in Venice in 1202, ready to sail to glory. But there was a problem, a catastrophic one. They couldn't pay for the ships. The Venetian doyer, Enrico Dandello, was 90 years old, reportedly blind in both eyes, but sharper than any blade forged in Damascus. He smelled opportunity the way sharks smell blood. "You owe us 85,000 silver marks," he said, his voice steady as stone. "I'll forgive the debt, all of it. If you do Venice one small favor, attack Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast, a city that had rebelled against Venetian control." The Crusader leaders hesitated. Pope Innocent III had explicitly forbidden attacking fellow Christians. The penalty was excommunication, eternal damnation, but they were broke, stranded in Venice, 30,000 armed men with nowhere to go, so they did it. November 2020, they sacked Zara, Christian soldiers, killing Christian civilians. The Pope excommunicated the entire army, and that's when the second deal with the devil arrived. A Byzantine prince named Alexio Angelos approached them. Young, desperate, promising everything. "Help me take back Constantinople from my uncle," he said. "I'll pay everything you're owed. Plus, I'll reunite the Orthodox Church with Rome. Plus, I'll fund your entire crusade to Egypt." It sounded too good to be true because it was. The Crusaders diverted to Constantinople, the wealthiest Christian city on earth, home to treasures beyond imagination, ancient libraries, irreplaceable relics, and yes, dozens of monasteries and convents, thousands of monks and nuns who believed their holy vows would protect them. They arrived in June 1203. Through a combination of diplomacy and threat, they installed young Alexios on the throne. He promised the moon, he delivered nothing. No money, no church reunion, no supplies. By January 1204, the Byzantines had had enough. They overthrew Alexios. Some say they strangled him with a bowring and installed a new emperor who told the Crusaders to leave immediately or face annihilation. Now the Crusaders were trapped, broke, starving, humiliated. They'd been excommunicated, lied to, played for fools, and they were camped outside the wealthiest Christian city in the world. The Crusader leaders held a council. The decision isn't recorded in official documents, but the result speaks for itself. April 9th, 1204, the Crusaders attacked. If this moment in history doesn't move you to learn more, you might be missing the lesson our ancestors died to teach, that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one who looks different from you, it's the one who looks the same, but has convinced himself that your suffering is justified. April 12th, 1204. Dawn. The Venetian fleet approaches Constantinople's sea-debut walls, massive ships with siege towers mounted on their decks. It's unprecedented, brilliant, terrifying. The city's defenders fight desperately, but they're exhausted, outnumbered, led by an emperor who's been on the throne less than 3 months. By midday, the Cial walls are breached. Emperor Alexios V flees through a secret gate, taking what's left of the imperial treasury with him. The city is leaderless, defenseless, and then something breaks. There's no organized occupation, no military discipline. The Crusader commanders lose control. What happens next is 3 days that chroniclers will call the sack of Constantinople, but those 3 words, clinical and distant, don't capture the horror. Nikitas Chonates is there, a Byzantine historian, scholar, senator. He watches from a window as the Crusaders pour through the streets. Years later, when he finally finds the words, he writes, "They smashed the holy images and hurled the sacred relics of martyrs into places I am ashamed to mention. They brought horses and mules into the Church of Holy Wisdom to carry off the sacred vessels and the pulpit and the doors and the furniture. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, a building that had stood for nearly 7 centuries. Crusaders turn it into a stable. They smash the silver icon of stasis, the walls separating the nave from the altar, and load the pieces onto pack animals. A prostitute dances on the patriarch's throne, while drunken soldiers cheer. The altar of holy wisdom where emperors were crowned, where the liturgy had been sung without interruption for 700 years, is stripped bare and desecrated. But buildings can be rebuilt, relics can be recovered. What happens to the living is permanent. Constantinople is home to hundreds of monasteries and convents, thousands of monks and nuns who have devoted their entire lives to prayer, poverty, chastity. They believe their holy vows will protect them. They're wrong. The Crusaders move through the city like a plague. Nikitas writes, and his hand shakes as he forms the letters that they spared neither age nor sex, nor religious profession. That's medieval code, delicate language for something unspeakable. It means nuns. Sister Euphemia lies on the chapel floor, blood pooling beneath her head. She's still conscious, barely. The other nuns huddle against the far wall. The youngest is 17, Sister Anna, who took her vows only 6 months ago. The oldest is 81, Sister Maria, who has been praying in this chapel since before some of these soldiers' grandfathers were born. The Crusaders don't see brides of Christ, they see spoils of war. A knight steps forward, later identified in Venetian records as Guillaume of Champlit, a nobleman from Burgundy. He's wearing full armor, a red cross on white linen covers his chest. He's drunk enough that his words slur, sober enough to know exactly what he's doing. These are heretics, he says in French, schismatics. The Pope himself has said they've broken from the true church. It's a lie. Pope Innocent III never said that. In fact, he'll later write that he's horrified by what happens here, but Guillaume either doesn't know or doesn't care. Sister Anna steps forward. She's holding a silver cross. Her grandmother's brought from her village in Macedonia. She speaks in broken Latin. We follow Christ. Same as you. We pray to same God. Please dash dash. Gorm rips the cross from her hands, examines it, then hurls it against the wall hard enough to dent the silver. Your Christ lost, he says. Ours won. What happens next isn't speculation. It's documented in multiple sources, Catholic and Orthodox. Some describe it clinically, others can barely form the words. The Devastatio Constantinopoliana, a contemporary account compiled from survivor testimonies, records it this way. The Latins violated the sanctity of holy places. They showed no reverence for virgins consecrated to God, nor for women of venerable age. They took them by force. And when the women resisted, the text stops. The scribe couldn't continue. But we know what happened, because Sister Euphemia survives. A later Orthodox source, the Chronicle of Novgorod, records testimony from refugees who fled to Russia. The Latins violated the nuns in the convents. They tore the icons from the walls and used them as tables for their feasts. They dressed dogs in priestly vestments and paraded them through the streets. And when the nuns tried to resist, again, the chronicle stops. The scribe couldn't or wouldn't write what came next. But we know from multiple sources, Catholic and Orthodox, because one Catholic chronicler, Geoffrey d'Alharda, who was actually with the Crusaders, admitted, since the world was created, never had so much booty been taken from any city. And another Catholic source, Papal Leot Peter of Capua, was so horrified that he wrote back to Rome. They spared neither age nor sex, nor religious profession, Sister Anna is 17 years old. Sister Maria is 81. It doesn't matter, the Crusaders take them. Not all of them die quickly. Venetian records from 1205, 1 year after the sack, show listings in the slave markets. Greek women of religious profession. Nuns were being sold as slaves to Christians by Christians. Some of these women ended up in harems in Venice. Others were shipped to Crusade estates in the Levant, forced to serve in households that mocked their vows daily. A few, very few, were eventually ransomed back by Orthodox communities who scraped together gold they didn't have. Most simply vanished from history. Sister Euphemia is one of the few who escapes. She flees Constantinople with a handful of other survivors, traveling through Greece, then farther east into Russia. She carries nothing but the clothes on her back and memories she'll spend the rest of her life trying to forget. 37 years later, when she's dying in a monastery in Thessalonica, she gives testimony to an Orthodox priest. She's 110 years old. Hands shake as she speaks. The priest writes down every word. The testimony is preserved in the Chronicle of Aos, buried in a monastery library for centuries. She describes watching Sister Maria, the abbess, try to protect the younger nuns. She describes Gorm of Champlit laughing as he rips the relic from Maria's hands. She describes what he said next. Your Christ lost, ours won. She describes Sister Maria, 68 years old, scratching Gorm's face hard enough to draw blood. She describes him throwing the old woman down the convent steps, the sound her skull made hitting the stone. Sister Maria dies 3 days later, never regains consciousness. Sister Euphemia describes watching the other nuns, 42 women ranging in age from 17 to 81, being dragged from the chapel. She describes their screams. She describes how some of the Crusaders wore the cross even as they committed acts that would make demons weep. He wore the cross. Her testimony reads, He wore the symbol of Christ's suffering, and He made us suffer in Christ's name. Years later, when Orthodox Christians finally reclaim Constantinople, they find something in the ruins of the convent of Christ Panipopes, scratched into the stone floor, barely visible, crude marks made with fingernails or shards of broken pottery, 43 small crosses, 43 names written in Greek, and beneath them in letters so faint they're almost invisible, Father, forgive them. They knew not what they did, except they did know. Gorm of Champlit knew exactly what he was doing when he threw a 68-year-old nun down those steps. The soldiers who dragged 17-year-old Sister Anna from the chapel knew exactly what they were doing. The Venetian merchants who sold Greek women of religious profession in the slave markets knew exactly what they were doing. They knew. And they did it anyway because they'd convinced themselves that these women, these Orthodox Christians, were heretics, schismatics, less than human, that Constantinople's wealth was rightfully theirs, that God himself had ordained this holy war, and anyone who stood in their way deserved whatever suffering came to them. They wore crosses. They prayed before battle. They took communion, and then they destroyed the very people they were supposed to protect. You've watched for 8 minutes. If you're still here, it's because part of you knows this story needs to be told. Subscribe to Crimson Historians, not for us, but for them. For the voices that were supposed to stay buried, for the women whose names were erased from history by the very people who claimed to fight in God's name. Now let's talk about what happened when the world found out. When news of the sack reaches Pope Innocent III in Rome, he's reportedly physically ill. He writes to the Crusader leadership, "How is the Greek Church to be brought back to unity and devotion to the Apostolic See, when it sees in the Latins only an example of pitchen and works of darkness, so that it now detests them more than dogs?" The Pope, who had excommunicated the Crusaders twice, realizes what his holy war has done. It has destroyed any chance of reuniting Christianity. Before 1204, there was still hope. Hope that the great schism of 1054 could be healed, that East and West could reconcile, that Orthodox and Catholic could be one church again after 1204. Impossible. The Orthodox Church will forever remember the Fourth Crusade as the great betrayal, the moment when Catholic crusaders proved they were more interested in gold than God. When men wearing crosses committed atrocities worse than any Muslim army had ever inflicted on Christian civilians. Pope Innocent III writes letter after letter condemning what happened, but the damage is done. The gold has been looted, the relics have been scattered across Europe, the women have vanished into slavery or death, and the Crusaders, most of them go home as heroes. Guillaume of Champlit, the knight who threw Sister Maria down those steps, becomes Prince of Achaia. He rules over conquered Byzantine territory for years, dies peacefully in his bed, is buried with honors in a church he built with looted Byzantine gold. The Byzantine Empire never recovers. Constantinople limps along for another 2.5 centuries, a shadow of its former glory. The Crusader kingdoms bleed it dry, fighting amongst themselves over the spoils. When the Ottomans finally conquer the city in 1453, many Orthodox Christians see it as God's judgment, not on them, but on the Latins who defiled it first. Better the turban of the Turk, they say, than the tiara of the Pope. Sister Euphemia lives until 1241. She's 110 years old when she dies in that monastery in Thessalonica. Before she passes, she gives one final instruction to the priest who's been recording her testimony. "Do not let them forget," she says. "Do not let them say, it was just war. Do not let them say, it was God's will." The priest nods. He copies her testimony carefully. Then he hides it in the monastery archives because the Catholic Church doesn't want this story told. And for centuries, it works. Western history books describe the Fourth Crusade as a tragic miscalculation, a regrettable diversion. They discuss the looting of Constantinople, the destruction of art and architecture. They debate whether the Crusaders were justified, whether the Byzantines brought it upon themselves through political chaos and broken promises. They don't talk about the nuns. They don't mention the 43 crosses scratched into the chapel floor. They don't name Sister Maria, thrown down the steps at 68 years old. They don't count Sister Anna, 17, sold in a Venetian slave market. They don't acknowledge Sister Euphemia, who spent 110 years carrying memories that never stopped bleeding. The historical record is sanitized, cleaned, made palatable for Western audiences who want to believe that the Crusades, however flawed, were fundamentally righteous, that Christian soldiers, however brutal, were fighting for a holy cause. The Orthodox Church remembers differently. In monasteries across Greece, Russia, Serbia, every year on April 13th, they hold a memorial service. Not for the buildings that were destroyed or the treasures that were stolen, for the women who were raised. For centuries, Sister Euphemia's testimony stays buried in that monastery library, forgotten, gathering dust. Until 1967, a Greek historian named Anastasio Karposilos is researching Byzantine responses to the Fourth Crusade. He's digging through the archives at Mount Aos when he finds it. An old manuscript, brittle pages, faded ink. He starts reading, and he can't stop. The testimony of Sister Euphemia, 110 years old, describing in vivid, painful detail what happened in the convent of Christ Panipapis on April 13, 1204. Karpazillos publishes it in 1970. The academic world barely notices it's in Greek. It's about nuns. It doesn't fit the narrative Western historians have been telling for 800 years. But the Orthodox Church notices they've known all along. They've been waiting for the world to listen until now. So why does this story matter? Because it's not about religion. It's not even about the Crusades. It's about what happens when people convince themselves that their cause is so righteous, so holy, so divinely ordained that anyone who stands in their way, even their own brothers and sisters, deserves whatever suffering comes to them. The Crusaders who violated those nuns believed they were doing God's work. They believed the Orthodox Christians were heretics who deserved punishment. They believed the wealth of Constantinople was rightfully theirs, payment for their holy mission. They wore crosses, they prayed before battle, they took communion, and then they destroyed the very people they were supposed to protect. Guillaume of Champlitte wasn't a monster, not in the way we think of monsters. He was a nobleman, educated, probably considered himself pious. He genuinely believed that what he was doing was justified. That Sister Maria, clutching her relic and begging for mercy, was standing between him and God's will. That's what makes this story terrifying. Not that evil men did evil things, but that ordinary men, convinced of their righteousness, committed atrocities and called it holy. History is written by the victors, but memory is written by the survivors. And the survivors, the Orthodox Church, the refugees, the testimonies that were buried and rediscovered, they remembered. For 800 years, they remembered. In 2004, 8 centuries after the sack, Pope John Paul II visited Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew in Istanbul, the city that was once Constantinople, the city that still bears the scars of 1204. And the Pope did something unprecedented. He apologized for the Fourth Crusade, for the sack of Constantinople, for the grave sins committed by Catholics against Orthodox Christians. It took 8 centuries, but finally someone acknowledged what happened. The nuns of Constantinople never got their apology. Sister Maria never heard anyone say her suffering mattered. Sister Anna, 17 years old, sold in a Venetian slave market, never knew that one day a pope would call what happened to her a grave sin. Their names are mostly lost. Their bodies were never properly buried. Their suffering was erased from Western history for generations, but their crosses remain scratched into stone. 43 silent witnesses. The 13th century Orthodox mystic Gregory Palamas, who was born just decades after the sack, wrote, "The Latins entered the house of God with harlots, profaned the altar, and made the church a dwelling for demons. They spared neither age, nor beauty, nor virtue." This was not the work of Christians, it was the work of men who had forgotten what the cross means. What the cross means. The cross was supposed to mean sacrifice, suffering for others, laying down your life for your friends. Christ didn't wear a cross as a symbol of conquest. He died on one as a symbol of love. But in 1204, the Crusaders turned it into a weapon. They stitched it onto their chests and used it to justify rape, murder, enslavement. They looked at women who had devoted their entire lives to Christ and saw only property to be taken. They forgot what the cross means. Sister Euphemia understood when she was dying at 110 years old, when the priest asked her if she forgave the men who destroyed her sisters. She said something that still echoes across 8 centuries. "I forgive them because Christ commands it, but I will not let them be forgotten, because forgetting is how it happens again." You've just witnessed one of history's darkest truths, a story that was buried, sanitized, and erased because it was too inconvenient, too ugly, too damning to the narrative of holy war. If stories like this remind you how fragile humanity is, how easily we convince ourselves that cruelty is justified when wrapped in the right symbols, then subscribe to Crimson Historians and keep the past alive, because some voices deserve to be heard even if they were silenced 800 years ago. Especially then the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome